The only real vengeance is the one where your enemy is forced to watch your ascent. Everything else is just a mutual suicide pact disguised as justice. Most people, when wronged, immediately turn their inner clock back to zero, dedicating their finite energy, their precious focus, to planning a retaliation that, even if successful, ultimately leaves them poorer, angrier, and psychologically tied to the person they claim to despise. This is not power. This is emotional parasitism. You have allowed your enemy to pitch a toxic tent inside your mind, and you are paying the rent with your creativity, your peace, and your future. The traditional eye for an eye revenge is the most self-destructive impulse in the human playbook because it grants your aggressor continued control over your emotional state, transforming you from a victim of an event into a slave to a memory. But there exists a different path, a psychological geometry so effective, so clean that it renders conflict obsolete. I call it the invisible vengeance. This is not about winning a battle. It is about dissolving the battlefield entirely. It is the strategy of making your opponent's existence irrelevant by making your own trajectory unstoppable. The goal is not to wound them, but to make their attempts to hurt you look pitiful, clumsy, and utterly inconsequential to the vast, powerful narrative of your life. This is the dark, functional truth that the petty and the weak will never grasp. The greatest power you possess is the disciplined withholding of your attention. The first pillar of this invisible warfare is strategic indifference. We have been conditioned to believe that ignoring an attack is a sign of weakness, that we must always respond, always defend, always justify. But look closer. When you react with fire to their spark, you validate their aggression. You prove their strategy worked. You feed the very mechanism designed to derail you. The enemy wants your anger, your tears, your public meltdown. These are the currency of their sad, small existence. When you respond to chaos with absolute, unshakable calm, you are denying them the oxygen they need to burn. You are not forgiving them. You are classifying their actions as background noise beneath your notice, functionally non-existent. This silence is not emptiness. It is a psychological brick wall. It broadcasts a single, terrifying message. You are not worth my time. If you find yourself consistently drawn into the shallow, distracting dramas that destroy real progress, if you are tired of trading profound insight for cheap emotional thrills, then you need to subscribe now. This is where we strip away the comforting lies and focus only on the mechanisms of power and self-mastery. The second, and most lethal component of the invisible vengeance is weaponized focus. If indifference is the shield, relentless self-improvement is the sword. Your energy, once dedicated to planning counterattacks, is now aggressively reinvested into your own value, your own skill, your own domain. Every hour you spend mastering a craft, building a legacy, or generating wealth is an hour that directly contributes to the enemy's humiliation. Because here is the brutal secret of the resentful mind. Their attacks are never about what you did. They are about who you are becoming. Their true motivation is the fear of your potential and the bitterness of their stagnation. They need you to fail to justify their own failures. Therefore, the ultimate act of psychological cruelty is not direct retaliation, but undeniable success achieved immediately following their attempt to sink you. Imagine the spiteful person who tried to sabotage your project, spread a rumor, or undermine your confidence. They watch, waiting for your collapse, waiting for the vindication that proves they were right to attack. And instead, they see you elevate. They see the rumor dissolve beneath the weight of your tangible achievements. They witness your promotion, your freedom, your peace. You haven't fought them. You have merely grown so large that they are now trapped in your shadow. Their hatred, once a weapon, becomes a slow-acting poison that they must swallow daily, forced to bear witness to the very future they tried desperately to prevent. The invisible vengeance is a long-term investment. It exploits the psychological gravity of the enemy, the fact that petty people are defined by their obsessions. They will continue to obsess over you, pouring their mental energy into tracking your movements and hoping for your downfall. Meanwhile, you have completely forgotten they exist, focused solely on the expansion of your own reality. You have outsourced their destruction to their own lack of discipline, their own inability to move past the injury they inflicted. You have weaponized their fixation against them, making their continuous obsessive hatred the definitive proof of their own failure and your absolute dominance. Remember this crucial distinction. Your enemy is not a threat. They are a tax on your attention, and the powerful refuse to pay the tax. The truly crippling realization for the attacker is not merely that you succeeded, but that they helped you. Their attack provided the specific, focused fuel necessary for your quantum leap. They wasted their capital, their time, their reputation, their mental bandwidth, investing it all in your demise, guaranteeing zero return. This is the silent psychological scaffold of invisible vengeance. The attacker is forced to endure a catastrophic loss of internal consistency. Their self-image, built upon the foundation of their ability to correctly judge and predict human failure, shatters. They must now reconcile two irreconcilable facts. I attacked this person because they were a threat, and I failed completely while they thrived, which means I am the incompetent one. If you want to understand these foundational truths of human behavior, the mechanics of power, and how to weaponize your own integrity against the chaos, then you need to subscribe right now and stop missing the essential knowledge that rewrites the rules of the social game. This dissonance, this forced revision of their personal history, is what destroys them from within. Their agony is rooted in a fundamental psychological defect, the inability to perceive the world as an arena of limitless creation. They are trapped in the prison of the zero-sum mentality. For the envious, every victory you achieve is a defeat they absorb personally. They cannot grasp the concept that your creation of wealth, peace, or mastery does not detract from their potential. They view all success as a finite pie, and you just took the last slice. This is why their suffering is relentless, because every beautiful thing you manifest in the world is a constant, irrefutable proof of their own internal scarcity. They cannot simply envy your car or your title. They envy the process that allowed you to acquire it, the self-discipline, the strategic patience, the capacity for delayed gratification that they themselves lack. They are not merely watching your success. They are watching the daily, effortless manifestation of the character traits they forfeited years ago. The psychological suffering is intensified by a phenomenon psychologists call the comparison trap, but we can define it more brutally: the unavoidable mirror of their own mediocrity. When they attacked you, they were operating from a position of relative security, certain that your fall would equalize the scoreboard. When you rise instead, they are forced into an unfavorable comparison that transcends status. They don't just see you earning more, they see you living with less stress, possessing greater clarity, and operating from a higher ethical altitude. They realize that the structural difference between you and them is not external circumstance, but the internal architecture of the soul. They have built their lives on reactive spite, attempting to drag others down to meet their level, while you focused entirely on elevation, making them irrelevant. The person who commits to the path of invisible vengeance understands that the greatest punishment is not pain inflicted, but potential realized. You force them to confront the terrifying thought, what if I had spent the last 5 years building instead of plotting? What if I had focused on my own life instead of becoming a devoted, unpaid chronicler of someone else's? The answer is their present reality, a stagnant, resentful existence haunted by the ghost of their own abandoned potential. The ultimate betrayal of the resentful mind is that it offers its greatest loyalty to external chaos. They need drama, they crave conflict, they define themselves by who they are fighting, not what they are creating. This addiction to conflict is exactly what the successful mind exploits. We recognize that attention is the most valuable, non-renewable resource we possess. When they try to pull you into their theater of pettiness, they are demanding a performance, an emotional expenditure, a surrender of your creative focus. The invisible vengeance is the refusal of the role. You do not argue the premise of their rumor. You do not defend your position against their cheap shot. You simply turn your focus to the single most productive thing you can do, forcing them to watch you build the empire they swore you couldn't reach. It is the ultimate statement of contempt. You are not even worth the energy required to swat you away. This profound indifference, this absolute lack of recognition, is the acid that corrodes their ego, because the only thing worse than being hated is being unseen. This essay itself is an exercise in focus, a dedicated rejection of filler content designed to deliver maximum psychological clarity. If this type of deep, unfiltered analysis is something you value, please consider subscribing. It's how we keep the lights on and the low-hanging fruit out. Their punishment is not a dramatic downfall, but a psychological slow burn, the realization that their attempts to injure you have merely strengthened your resolve, focused your purpose, and made your success that much sweeter. Every new milestone you hit acts as a fresh incision on their ego, a testament to the fact that their hatred was not merely ineffective, but cosmically misguided. They become the victim of their own fixation, bound by the chains of obsession to a person who has long since forgotten their name. Do not mistake this strategic indifference for some kind of moral high ground you are trying to occupy. That is another, more subtle trap of the resentful mind, the addiction to justification. The person who wastes their time composing a perfect, fact-checked defense email to a critic or penning the brilliant social media counterargument is still operating entirely within the enemy's frame. They have taken the moral narcotics of righteous anger, mistaking the fleeting chemical rush of being right for the actual, difficult work of being successful. The invisible vengeance does not require you to prove your goodness. It merely requires you to prove your competence, and the difference is absolute. Goodness is subjective and endlessly debatable. Competence is tangible and undeniable. Consider the archetype of the relentless builder, the CEO who created the impossible infrastructure, the one whose early years were defined by constant, low-grade journalistic sniping. The critics, confined to their small, echoing rooms, saw a target. They wrote endless op-eds about the founder's perceived moral failings, their supposed eccentricities, or the minor glitches in the early prototypes. They demanded interviews and explanations, hoping to draw the CEO into a petty rhetorical boxing match. Yet the builder did not stop to argue the premise of their criticism, because the premise itself was insignificant. While the media obsessed over the color of the lobby curtains, a superficial detail they could easily understand and debate, the architect was busy designing the foundation, the logistics chain, and the impossible algorithms that would support a multi-trillion-dollar edifice. The founder understood a fundamental truth. If you are creating something exponentially larger than your critics can comprehend, you must necessarily ignore their judgment, because their worldview is too small to contain your reality. The brutal proof arrived when the critics, a decade later, found themselves writing their pieces on platforms, utilizing infrastructure, and relying on logistics systems built entirely by the person they once dismissed as an arrogant fool. They didn't just lose the argument, they became functionally dependent upon the victor, trapped in a reality defined by the success they fought so hard to deny. That is the definition of psychological checkmate, to force your enemy to use your own strength to carry their petty complaints. The energy you save by refusing to engage in that zero-sum conflict is the fuel for your next monumental leap. Every hour not spent defending your reputation is an hour spent perfecting your craft, scaling your operations, or deepening your insight. This requires a profound, almost spiritual discipline, the ability to recognize the psychological pull of drama and ruthlessly sever the connection, understanding that every moment of attention you give to negativity is a tithe paid to stagnation. This kind of disciplined perspective, this dedication to actionable psychology over satisfying melodrama, is not easy to maintain. It requires constant reinforcement. If you find this unflinching analysis valuable, and if you are committed to building your own psychological fortress against the noise of the envious, join us. Subscribing is the best way to support the creation of this kind of deep dive content and ensure this platform remains committed to the strategies of true, radical competence. We have been conditioned by years of cheap television and manufactured outrage to believe that conflict is inherently interesting and necessary for growth. But conflict, when it is low-level and personalized, is merely a sophisticated distraction mechanism, a highly efficient energy vampire designed to bleed the focused mind dry. The most successful people are not those who are best at fighting, but those who are best at escaping the fight entirely. Their genius lies in their ability to redefine the playing field. They don't engage with the rules of the enemy. They build a new arena where the enemy's rules no longer apply. The person caught in the cycle of resentment wants you to play chess. The focused mind lifts the board and builds a spaceship, rendering the arguments about pawns and queens completely irrelevant. This act of redefinition, this creation of a new, higher-altitude reality, is the ultimate and most elegant form of self-defense. It is the realization that your focus is not just a tool for creation, but your primary weapon of psychological war. It defends you from the mundane entropy of human jealousy. The resentful person cannot understand this, because their entire identity is tethered to the ground, defined by proximity to others and the need for external validation. They measure their worth by the small, temporary damage they inflict, while the builder measures their worth by the scale and permanence of the structures they erect. This leads us to the final, devastating insight regarding invisible vengeance. It is a self-sustaining psychological machine that feeds on the enemy's own obsession. Because you do not give them the satisfying closure of a direct fight, they must internally generate the reasons for their fixation. They become a perpetual motion machine of self-torture. Their imagined victory fantasies are the only reward they receive, and those fantasies require constant draining maintenance. This truth is perhaps the darkest. The most effective strategy against your enemies is not to defeat them, but to induce a state of philosophical and psychological starvation, where their entire emotional diet consists of stale, self-generated hatred aimed at a ghost who has already transcended their petty reality. The only thing they are truly destroying is their own future potential, binding their spirit to a past conflict that you, the focused architect, have already forgotten. This is the definitive verdict. Resentment is not a weapon aimed at others. It is a spiritual anesthetic that paralyzes the user, guaranteeing they remain stagnant. The successful life is simply the refusal of that anesthetic, the commitment to movement, and the ultimate elegant contempt of refusing to even acknowledge the existence of the petty theater below. If this level of uncompromising psychological strategy resonates with you, then commit to the clarity. Subscribe now and join the community dedicated to building things too big to hate. We are constantly fed the spiritual opiate that demands we engage with our suffering, that we must seek reconciliation, or worse, that we owe our detractors empathy or explanation. This is perhaps the greatest and most insidious lie in the modern psychological playbook. It is the lie of moral self-immolation. Society tells you to take the high road, which sounds noble, but often translates practically into accepting a temporary ceasefire with a spiritual parasite. True psychological mastery rejects this obligation entirely. It recognizes that in the brutal ecology of human interaction, some connections are fundamentally pathological, serving only as emotional black holes designed to siphon off the energy you need for elevation. To engage with the resentful person on their terms, to offer them the dignity of a response or the therapeutic closure of conflict, is not an act of moral superiority. It is a tactical blunder. It is a psychological capitulation that grants them a seat at your table. The truly successful person understands the principle of necessary coldness. You do not owe explanation to those committed to misunderstanding you. You do not owe empathy to those who define themselves by your downfall. Their narrative is their prison, and your involvement merely gives them the illusion that the jailer is worried about their comfort. You must treat persistent resentment not as a personal slight requiring emotional engagement, but as an existential infection requiring absolute quarantine. The only appropriate response to spiritual parasitism is intellectual sterility. The high road is not walked toward your enemy to offer a hand. The high road is the one that curves so sharply upwards that you leave their entire dimension of conflict behind. This kind of ruthless clarity about human motives is often rejected by the mainstream, preferring the warm, comforting illusion of universal niceness. But if you value this unblinking, deep psychological excavation, if you believe this level of analysis is necessary to navigate a truly complex world, then pause and make sure you have subscribed. Supporting this channel is supporting the intellectual infrastructure required to keep uncovering these necessary, difficult truths. The true philosophical debt you carry is only to your future self, to the potential waiting to be actualized. Every second spent validating a toxic external narrative is a second stolen from that future. Therefore, the strategy of invisible vengeance culminates in a profound act of psychological triage, identifying and ruthlessly excising every relationship, every memory, and every thought pattern that draws you back toward the earthbound, the small, and the static. You become, in essence, an existential minimalist, shedding all but the essentials required for ascent. This is the difference between mere achievement and philosophical freedom. Achievement collects things. Freedom discards constraints. The resentment of your enemies is merely the final, irrelevant constraint that you must learn to forget exists. Their opinion is merely static on a radio that you have permanently turned off. You cease to be a combatant and become, instead, an atmospheric condition they must simply endure. The struggle to disengage, the suffering that keeps the target bound to the conflict, is born from a single catastrophic cognitive error. We instinctively mistake the resentment for genuine feedback. Our programming demands that we seek equilibrium, that we acknowledge and address injustice, and the resentful person weaponizes this moral imperative. They present their internal rage not as their pathology, but as evidence of your objective moral failing, forcing you into a futile defense. This is the narcissistic gravity well. The resentful individual cannot tolerate being left behind, so they generate immense psychological drag, seeking to pull the ascending person back into their shared orbit of mediocre misery. The core of their argument is never about you. It is a desperate attempt to externalize the agonizing distance between their self-image and their actual accomplishments. To admit that their stagnation is self-inflicted would be too painful. It is far easier, far more comfortable, to believe that you are succeeding at their expense, that the universe is actively biased against their untapped potential. This necessary psychological scaffolding of victimhood is why they cannot and will not accept your apology, your explanation, or your generosity. Any genuine attempt at reconciliation is perceived as an attempt to dismantle the very structure that justifies their inaction. You must internalize the fact that the drama they manufacture is strictly a maintenance ritual for their own ego. They are psychic vampires, not because they steal your vitality directly, but because they require the emotional energy of your reaction to sustain their narrative. When you engage, when you defend, when you counterattack, you are simply plugging yourself into their life support system. The pain you feel in being falsely accused or misunderstood is not caused by their words. It is caused by the assumption that their words matter. The moment you recognize that their entire dimension of reality operates on a closed loop of self-justification, the emotional urgency vanishes. You cease to care what the prisoner thinks of the architect who built the prison, especially when that prisoner is entirely self-caged. This ruthless psychological detachment is the only humane path, both for you and, paradoxically, for them. It denies them the false comfort of believing they are engaged in a noble fight against tyranny, forcing them, eventually, to face the silence of their own responsibility. Invisible vengeance, therefore, is not a spiteful act. It is the ultimate administrative simplification. It is the refusal to carry anyone else's emotional freight, especially when that freight is solely composed of bitterness and accusation. The profound peace achieved through this absolute quarantine is not merely the absence of conflict. It is the radical presence of potential unlocked by severing the false debts that others attempted to impose. The true freedom of the mind is measured by the number of people whose opinions you can hear without feeling a corresponding compulsion to reply, defend, or adjust your path. When you fully grasp that your silence is not weakness but the ultimate statement of spiritual superiority, that you have effectively declared their judgment null and void in the court of your own being, you achieve an elevation few ever reach. This requires continuous intellectual discipline, a willingness to scrutinize your own motives for the hidden desire to be liked or validated, the final, most subtle trap. If this rigorous, uncompromising pursuit of philosophical strength resonates with your view of the world, if you recognize the necessity of this high-altitude perspective for navigating complex human landscapes, then join the community dedicated to these difficult truths. Subscribe now, and let us continue to build the intellectual tools required to truly transcend the fray. The final verdict on your life is not delivered by those who stand still and point. It is written only by the pace of your own ascent. The true cost of engaging in endless petty conflict is not the time wasted, but the corruption of your inner philosophy, the slow poisoning of your clarity by the emotional detritus of others. If you permit their drama to define your response, you have already lost, regardless of the rhetorical score. The ultimate and only sane verdict on the vast majority of human interaction is this: indifference is not a failure of character. It is the highest achievement of psychological hygiene. It is the realization that 99% of what people call morality or justice is merely a thinly veiled attempt to force someone else to feel what they refuse to feel themselves. You are not obligated to accept that transfer. Your silence is not a void waiting to be filled by their noise. It is a fortress, impenetrable and complete. This invisible vengeance, this absolute severance of emotional tether, delivers the final blow because it eliminates the one thing they truly crave, the evidence of their own importance in your life. When you refuse to be a mirror for their anxieties, they vanish. I believe this deep, self-determined detachment is the great ethical imperative of our time. We are drowning in a sea of manufactured outrage, a culture addicted to the rapid consumption and immediate regurgitation of offense. To guard your attention, that finite, irreplaceable, sacred resource is the single most profound act of personal rebellion left. Do not let your focus be hijacked by the ghosts of grievances past or the specters of arguments yet to come. Treat your mind not as a public square where every passing opinion merits a defense, but as a heavily guarded treasury. When someone approaches you with a demand for validation or an accusation seeking your energy, you must learn to see them not as an adversary, but as a tax collector attempting to levy a fee on your existence. Your answer must be a silent, resounding refusal to pay. The freedom found in this refusal is terrifyingly absolute. It forces you to acknowledge that your peace is entirely self-sourced and requires no external validation or victory. Only when you stop measuring your success by the number of battles you've won and start measuring it by the sheer lack of battles you feel compelled to even notice, do you finally begin to live according to your own law. This level of self-mastery is not intuitive. It must be built, defended, and continually honed through intellectual rigor. If you recognize the profound necessity of protecting your mental sovereignty in an age that demands you offer it up daily, if you are dedicated to living not merely better, but fundamentally deeper than the crowd, then join us. Subscribe to this channel and become part of the community committed to mastering the difficult, necessary, and ultimately liberating art of psychological independence. The final, brutal truth is this: the greatest weapon against the agent of chaos, the manipulator, or the emotional vampire is not your righteous anger, nor your meticulously constructed defense, but your utter and complete silence. They are waiting for the drama, the defense, the energy transfer, the confirmation that they still hold the reins of your attention. Deny them the reaction, and you deny them reality. You do not owe them closure, clarity, or explanation. You owe yourself peace. This silence is the verdict. This absence is the ultimate counterpunch. When you walk away not in fury, but in quiet indifference, you are declaring a truth far more devastating than any accusation you could level. You are declaring that they are fundamentally irrelevant to the architecture of your life. The power of psychological independence is not that you can fight better, but that you realize you no longer have to fight at all. The highest form of freedom is achieved not when you win a public feud, but when you realize that your purpose is not to be a well-adjusted, constantly reacting cog in their machine of endless conflict. Your purpose is to be a force unto yourself, a separate gravity that cannot be influenced by the noise below. The goal is not to win the argument. The goal is to realize there never was an argument worth having, only a desperate bid for your finite resources. The moment you accept that certain people are not worth hating, they cease to exist entirely. If you find yourself nodding, not because this realization is easy, but because you recognize the immense, liberating weight of truth behind this necessary separation, then you already know where you belong. We are charting a difficult course toward genuine psychological self-ownership, demanding intellectual honesty and rigor, and we require serious navigators for this journey. If this challenging, necessary path is your journey, then join us. Subscribe now and become part of the community dedicated to mastering the only sovereignty that truly matters, the sovereignty of the self. The final reckoning, therefore, is not a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet, irreversible withdrawal of attention. When you stop fighting for your reputation against ghosts, you finally free the energy required to build the empire they can never touch. This is the ultimate luxury of the psychologically rich. They can afford to ignore the noise entirely because they know that your integrity is not proven by your words, but by the quality of your solitude. Never forget this essential truth. The highest purpose of self-mastery is not self-defense, but the complete, uncompromising dedication to creation over reaction. The greatest power you hold is the power to deem someone unworthy of your time, your energy, and your hatred. We'll see you in the next deep dive.